New York versus SF or the Bay Area. You don't have to worry about parking and you don't have to worry about traffic, which I think are major things here in the Bay Area that we deal with. And not only do they work in tech, they work for big name companies like Google or Facebook. In New York, there's just always something going on every day, every weekend. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Brittany and I'm a lawyer that used to live in New York City and I now live in the Bay Area, or specifically Silicon Valley. So I wanted to do a comparison video of New York versus SF or the Bay Area because a lot of you guys ask me, what's the difference? Why'd you move? And personally, I think it'd be interesting to know what people think about the different coasts. So a little bit of background. I am from the Bay Area. I lived here until I was 17 and then I moved to UC San Diego for college, and then I went to Chapman University in Orange for law school. So I was in SoCal for a pretty long time until I got married to my husband Hui, and then it was his idea to move to New York City. So we moved to New York City after we got married and lived there for the past 3 years. We lived in Manhattan and I have a whole series about my life in New York City if you're interested. But after that, we decided it was time to move back to California, so we decided to move to the Bay Area. So like I said, I'm from East Bay, but I haven't been back since I was 17 except for holidays and such, so I haven't lived here in a long time. Since that time, I feel like the Bay Area has changed a lot, and although I do not live in San Francisco, I do visit quite often on the weekends, so I think I have a fairly good idea of the differences. But again, there's probably microcultures as there are microclimates here, and so I think most of my experience will be more based on the Silicon Valley, but I think you can take it as a whole comparison of the Bay Area versus New York City. So let's get right into the comparison. The first category will be traffic. This is a pretty big difference because New York City has a subway system which almost everyone in Manhattan and even outside of the outer boroughs takes because it's so convenient. There's so many different subway lines, it's very easy, it's pretty reliable. I would say there are some times there's train traffic and it gets annoying, but for the most part you don't have to worry about parking and you don't have to worry about traffic, which I think are major things here in the Bay Area that we deal with. So I obviously had to buy a car when I moved back, and even though my work is only about 15 miles away from my home, it takes me 30 plus minutes getting there, and coming home sometimes it can take up to 45 minutes to an hour. So it's pretty crazy that traveling such a short distance could create so much traffic. There's also that concern that if you meet up with someone after work, are you going against traffic or with traffic, because you might not be willing to drive even if it's 1 or 2 cities over. Whereas in New York, I feel like everyone was willing to go anywhere. And I feel like the Bay Area is definitely more spread out because you not only have San Francisco, but you have South Bay, you have the Peninsula, Silicon Valley, you have East Bay, you have Sacramento if you really want to go up there. So I think there's different places to go, but they take a while to drive, whereas if you're on the subway, you're just sitting on the subway for a little bit. That's another thing about the subway that I thought was convenient, was that you can read, you can listen to music, which I guess you can in the car too, but you can be productive while you're on the subway, whereas when you're in the car, you have to drive and pay attention. One thing though that I like about having my own car is I have my own space, I know it's clean, I can listen to my music, I can call people, I can store things in the trunk throughout the whole day. So that's one thing that's good, but then you have to worry about parking. So paying for parking, looking for parking, whereas in New York, you just take the subway to wherever you want to go and then walk from there. Speaking of walking is definitely different. I think people in SF might walk a little bit more, but I feel like the neighborhoods are a little more spread out and you're not really sure where you're walking. And because it's not as populated or as crowded as New York City, there's not always people on the street. I feel like in New York City, there's always people everywhere, no matter what time of day it is. So you always feel pretty safe because there's someone next to you or near you. Whereas in San Francisco, you might be in some deserted street, which might not be a good neighborhood and you wouldn't know. So I feel like most people take Ubers or Lyfts, or they bike, or they take the BART. But in New York, it's pretty easy to walk and you get used to walking. That's just something to do. So I remember in New York, I'd be willing to walk like about 0.8 miles, maybe even a mile with no hesitation, but here that seems really long. So I think the walking mentality is different in New York versus San Francisco. So next I want to talk about work life. And obviously take this with a grain of salt. I've only worked at one company in New York and so far one company in the Bay Area, but I've tried to talk to other people and I think it really depends on the type of company you work for. But I would say overall, most people that you meet will work in tech. I mean, it's called Silicon Valley for a reason, but even in San Francisco, there's a lot of tech companies. Healthcare is also sort of a bigger thing, but I would say most of the people that I know work in tech. And not only do they work in tech, they work for big name companies like Google or Facebook. And it's not uncommon to meet several people that work for these companies. I feel like in New York, there's a range of people that are either students or grad students, they're teachers, they may be lawyers, or they may be working in tech, they may be doing marketing, or they might work at, they might be CPAs or accountants. But here, I just feel like most people I meet are software engineers, or they're just working in a tech type company. So it's definitely it's much more common out here than it is in New York City. I would say that if you don't work for one of these big companies, you're kind of an outlier. Like if you work for a no-name startup or something, and if people haven't heard of the name of the company that you work for, they're pretty surprised. So I think that is one thing that is different out here. Another thing is the work-life balance. I don't know if it's because people who work in the Bay Area are a little older, and maybe that's just in the Silicon Valley area, but maybe in New York, my thought is most people that live in New York are younger. Most people that live in the city are probably in their 20s or 30s, and maybe they don't have families yet. And I think people might get married later there as well, so they have no families to go back to. But here in the Bay Area, a lot of people have kids, they have wives or husbands, and they want to get home sooner. Another thing is that a lot of people don't live near where they work. So because the subway is so easy, even if you do live a little further, it's not that hard, and because there's no traffic. But here, because there's so much traffic, people leave work early. People leave work pretty much like at 5 o'clock or even earlier if they live like an hour away, because they want to beat traffic and they want to get home sooner. So because of that, I feel like the workday is shifted. People start earlier, but they end earlier. And even then, it doesn't seem like people work that much overtime at work. I remember in New York when I would leave around 6, there's still a ton of people still there. But here when I leave, it's like a ghost town. So I think people just tend to leave earlier just because they want to beat traffic or get back home to their families. And then they might sign back on online, but they don't stay at work that late. And again, this might be a personality thing, but I also feel like the work pace is a little slower. Again, it depends on who you are and the type of company you work for. But I remember when I worked at this new company, I was churning things out so quickly, and I think they weren't really used to that. I think the pace is much smaller. I think New York has that hustling vibe, and you just feel like you always have to be on the go, doing things, being efficient, being productive. And I think San Francisco is a little bit like that, at least more than LA, but it's still not at the level of New York. So if you're coming from New York to San Francisco, I think your pace of life and your work life, it will be much different, which is a good thing, I think, because people are don't seem to be as super stressed, but they have a little more balance in their lives. All right, let's talk about living situations and living in the Bay Area versus New York. People think that the cost of living is more expensive in New York, but I'm sure most of you have been hearing that San Francisco is actually more expensive than New York City, and I believe it. Even out here, the prices are not any cheaper, if not the same. But I will say that you might get a little bit more space for what you're paying for, and it's a little nicer. So I think because the buildings in New York are so old, if you really want a new, nice, newly built or more remodeled apartment, you're probably going to be paying a lot. Whereas here, there's a little bit more of these nicer apartments or newly remodeled apartments. So you'll probably be paying around the same amount as you would have paid in New York, but get a little nicer of a place. I mean, you guys remember my apartment in New York, and we're paying about the same price here, if not a little more, but not by much. And we got double the size and like brand new hardwood flooring and appliances and things. Of course, we were blessed, and that was a little bit of a surprise to us, but I would say you have a little more options here that are slightly nicer than in New York for paying about the same. So one thing I also noticed about SF versus New York is that the homeless population is a little more obvious in San Francisco, and I'm not sure what the reason is. I haven't done research into it. There's definitely homeless people in New York, but I feel like they kind of keep to themselves. They're not as aggressive, and the amount of them is not as much as in San Francisco. I feel like there's just more homeless people no matter where you're walking, and they seem a little more aggressive in trying to get money from you, talking to you, going into nicer areas, walking into department stores and things. I think it's a thing to keep in mind if you're moving here, or if you're sort of comparing the two. That's another thing that I've noticed. Okay, so you guys know that I love to explore and do fun things, and I think one thing about living in the Bay Area, especially if you don't live in San Francisco, is it's a little harder to get to because again of the traffic and driving. Whereas in New York, I feel like because we lived in Manhattan, even though we lived on the Upper East Side, it was still only about 20 to 30 minutes from like Soho or downtown. So it doesn't feel as bad because you're just taking the subway. Here we have to drive to San Francisco and it could take up to an hour depending on where you are. And so I think it feels a little further and it really is a trek to get there. So because of that, if you don't live in the city, there's probably not as many fun things to do in the surrounding areas. I would say most of the pop-ups or the shopping or the fun things that I would find in New York are all in San Francisco, and even then there's not that many. Maybe I just haven't discovered them yet, but I felt like in New York there's just always something going on every day, every weekend. Here it's a little harder to find, and because things are a little more spread out, it's more difficult to go from one place to the other. So I would say that fun things to do, unless you like nature. People that live in the Bay Area are really into hiking and nature, and so those are the types of things that they do for fun, whereas it's not something I typically enjoy, and maybe that's why it feels like there's less to do. Next, let's talk about food. So far, I would say that the food in New York is probably better. Again, I've only been here for a few months, but I just feel like the types of places that open up in New York are a little more innovative, and if a chef is to open a restaurant, I feel like they think about New York first before they think about SF. SF definitely has their good food and they have certain gems, but overall, I feel like I haven't been as impressed. Also, because I live in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of good places out here, but they're just a little more spread out and they're a little more few and far between. So I would say overall, since I've been here, I feel like the food is better in New York. So the last topic is weather, which is obviously a huge difference. The Bay Area or California is not as cold as New York City. However, I will say in the summertime, it doesn't get as humid and as hot here as it does in New York City, which I actually liked. And I feel like for my skin, I prefer the humidity, so I kind of miss that. California or the Bay Area is very dry and it's actually colder than LA. So if you're comparing the two places, I would say that NorCal is maybe 10 to 20 degrees colder than it would be in LA, but much warmer than it is in New York City. However, you still need a pretty good jacket. I think temperatures could be around 40 degrees in the morning and at night, so it's definitely not as warm as it would be, as you think it would be. Also keeping in mind that San Francisco has these things called microclimates, where one part of SF might be super warm and the other part might be super cold. And I think it just depends on the type of weather or where you are in location to the bay. Another thing I noticed about SF is that it's almost always cold and windy and gloomy there. There's only a few days out of the year where it's really nice, but that's pretty rare. And for someone who enjoys warmer weather, that's not great. And when I think about going to SF, I'm always like, okay, it's gonna be windy and it's gonna be cold. So preparing for that is important. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video about New York City versus SF or the Bay Area. If you have any questions, don't forget to comment below. Check out my other videos about living here in the Silicon Valley or living in New York if you're interested. Let me know if there's anything that I missed or if there's anything that you've noticed about the two areas. And if you had to ask me which one I prefer, it really depends. I think it depends on what you want to get out of your city. Are you younger? Do you not have a family? Do you want to live in an exciting place that you're used to more of a hustle and bustle and getting things done but being efficient? Then I would say New York. But if you're trying to start a family or you want to be near family, you want to have a little more space, I would say SF. It's also the culture itself is a little different, but they're somewhat similar. I would say if you're comparing like New York versus LA, it'd be very different, but New York versus SF is a little more similar in the types of people that live here. But because of the tech culture that is built in SF, people are very tech oriented and tech minded. They're very smart. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.